to de-escalate the situation using the diplomatic means.
Well, let's go live to our correspondent in Geneva, John Zarakostas. John, we just heard Andriy Deshitsa there calling for diplomacy and what he called a concrete and adequate response. What might that actually mean, and are we going to get it today?
Well, basically, Ukraine, the European Union and the United States want two concrete results from the Russians. One, a de-escalation of the crisis in the eastern provinces. And secondly, the Russians to demobilize the 40,000 troops amassed near the Ukrainian border. They're the two key aspects and the focus of these talks. And in return, the Russians are expecting to hear concrete answers from the Ukrainians on how they plan to go forward on constitutional reforms and to give greater autonomy to the Russian-speaking populations in the East.
And John, we have heard lots of pessimism, hints from the White House about new sanctions. Doesn't that kind of talk threaten to undermine today before they've even got round the table?
Well, these are international talks. An element of brinkmanship to get the upper hand in the talks is standard. But in these talks about sanctions, the Europeans are more nervous than the Americans because the dependence of Europe on trade with Russia is far greater than the trade the United States. The Europeans have something in the order of two-way trade of $500 billion with Russia.
Thanks very much, John Zarakostas, who will be giving us updates later on in the day as those talks continue in Geneva. Well, within Ukraine itself, there have been clashes between armed gunmen at the Black Sea port of Mariupol this Thursday morning. The Interior Minister reported on his Facebook page that 3 people have died, though we can't verify that information independently for now. Elsewhere in the east, Kiev has confirmed that a convoy of army vehicles has been seized by pro-Russians in Kramatorsk. That's the town where the Ukrainian military had announced it had retaken an airbase just one day before. Pro-Russian armed groups have now seized administrative and police buildings in over half a dozen eastern towns. Our team on the ground has been to Kramatorsk, where they found some Ukrainian soldiers preferring to beat a retreat than come into conflict with their own people. Julia Lyubova reports.
I'm on the outskirts of Kramatorsk, a town in the Donetsk region where the Ukrainian government say they've retaken a local airdrome on Tuesday night, while a column of Ukrainian army's tanks and people carriers and armored vehicles were moving towards Kramatorsk this morning, but they were stopped by a shield of local people, by a human shield of local people. 4 of these armored vehicles managed to come through, but 13 remain here. Well, the local people say they will not allow them to come through. They say they don't want them here in their town.
We don't want a war. Let these guys put their arms down and go home to their wives. Yes, if they have them.
We are not meant for a war with civilians. I see that people here are unarmed, innocent civilians. There is no attempt to retake our weapons. They are peaceful civilians.
The soldiers are waiting for orders from the Ukrainian government on what steps to take, while the local people are handing them food and water and cigarettes. And despite a seemingly good atmosphere at the moment, there were some clashes here earlier when one man was beaten up by one of the soldiers, as he says. Well, as well as the civil defense people who are barricading and occupying government buildings in Kramatorsk are also here, and they say they will not move until their requests are heard, and their requests are federalization and independence for their region.
Until we see that we have been noticed, until some measures are taken, then we will decide something.
The local people in Pcholkino on the outskirts of Kramatorsk have managed to push the army back. A battalion of 14 tanks and armored vehicles is now heading to its base in Dnepropetrovsk. The soldiers removed the shutters from their guns and tanks. But the local people here remain skeptical, but hopeful that the army will not be returning overnight.
Now, bad weather and strong sea currents are hampering efforts to rescue over 280 people who are still unaccounted for after a ferry sank off the South Korean coast. At least 6 people are known to have died when the ship capsized in calm waters on Wednesday. Close to 500 people were on board the ship, which was travelling to the holiday island of Jeju. Many of them were high school students. Now, divers have tried and failed to get inside the ship, which is now almost completely submerged. Kate Moody reports.
A solemn pilgrimage, as relatives of those on board the capsized ferry boat were taken to the place where the vessel sank a day earlier to monitor the ongoing search efforts. On shore, other family members huddled together, grieving and waiting for news. A fight broke out as some distressed relatives pressed for rescue operations to be stepped up.
Other parents have received text messages saying there are about 15 people in the sunken ferry. Rescue teams couldn't enter the ferry because of the strong tidal current.
I was in the school where they told us to wait from 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. But they repeatedly said the same things. Nothing was new. Ministers and lawmakers visiting here are useless. They just took pictures.
The search for survivors resumed on Thursday morning, with more than 500 Coast Guard and Navy divers taking the lead. Almost 100 military and fishing vessels are active, as well as 18 helicopters. The ferry itself is now almost completely submerged, and fears over the fate of the 290 people still missing have intensified. Officials say the rescue efforts have been hampered by strong currents and poor visibility. It's still unclear why the boat listed on its side and then sank in calm water, with more than 460 people on board, including many teenage students who were on a school trip. The ferry company has apologized for the accident.
I would like to say sorry to the passengers, including a number of students and their parents, and promise that our company will do its best to minimize loss of life. We are sorry.
The last major ferry disaster in South Korea was in 1993. 292 people were killed.
Now, there's been a rare public show of defiance against the government in Algeria ahead of today's presidential election. A small group gathered in the capital on Wednesday, calling the vote a farce and trying to stage a sit-in, though they were dragged away by police. Several opposition parties have called for the poll to be boycotted. The 77-year-old sitting president Abdelaziz Bouteflika is expected to win a fourth term. Now, the campaign group Amnesty International has criticised the election campaign as being neither free nor fair. Our reporter Catherine Norris-Trent is in Algiers for voting day for us. Catherine, what's the atmosphere there at the start of election day?
Well, Algerians are really holding their breath to see how this election passes off. People are hoping that it will pass off peacefully and there'll be no incidences of violence. That's very important for the population here. But there are signs now that Algeria, perhaps this election compared to previous presidential votes, is perhaps starting to change. We've seen opposition demonstrations, small groups of people coming out onto the streets, very quickly reprimanded by Algerian security forces, arrested and then later released. And we have seen the opposition candidate, Ali Ben Fliss, who's the president's main rival, former prime minister of Algeria himself. Well, he has been managing to gather support, crisscrossing the country, addressing large crowds at rallies, and he's managed to get support from various factions around Algeria, so young people, people in the south of Algeria, in the Kabyle region, in the east, even some Islamist groups, although other Islamist parties are boycotting this vote. 6 parties boycotting the vote, saying that they're not going to legitimize it with their support. So there are signs that behind the scenes, perhaps the power structure of Algeria is slowly now starting to change, with the older generation perhaps now shifting in the power balance. But people are watching this very closely.
And Catherine, let's talk more closely about Abdelaziz Bouteflika himself. He's 77, he's served 3 terms already. He suffered a stroke last year and is visibly not in good health. During the campaign, we've heard a lot from his detractors saying he's not fit to be president. So why would you say he is still expected to win this 4th term?
Well, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, even though he is aging and visibly frail and weak, still does have support from a part of the Algerian population, a very sizable part. They see him still as a hero of the War of Independence against France in the 1960s. He's also seen by many as the man who brought peace and stability to Algeria after a decade-long and very deadly civil war in the 1990s, and seen as a man who helped to reunite the country after that. So people are very nervous about what would happen after Bouteflika and what would happen if there was political change. And they're also looking around to countries in the region, Libya and Tunisia, where there have been uprisings and now violence. They've got Islamist groups in the country very active, and they're saying we don't want that in Algeria. So people still very, I would say, traumatized by the legacy of violence and not wanting any more instability.
Thanks very much. Catherine Norris-Trent there in Algiers, who will be reporting throughout election day for us here on France 24. Thanks very much.